And now I invite Dr. Robert Lord from the American University School of International Service. Robert is a candidate in the International Peace and Conflict Resolution Program at American University School of International Service, specializing in transitional justice. His research and career interests lie in the field of interventional humanitarian law, genocide prevention and punishment, and the nexus of gender and security. He maintains a regional focus in East Africa and the Great Lakes region, the Sahel, and South Central Asia. And his lecture will be concerned about France and Rwanda, politicizing legal responsibility for genocide.
I had actually planned to have a jackhammer playing behind me while I gave this presentation, so the hammer is actually more appropriate. So as Dr. Charbit said, I'm Rob Lord. Unfortunately, I don't have my PhD yet, so please disregard the doctoral signifier there on the program. I am a research associate currently at the Public International Law and Policy Group, where I work with transitional justice initiatives in Burma and South Sudan. I'm just going to speak through this. This past summer, I was in Burma researching the role of technology in the prevention of genocide, which is something that I've noticed, and maybe it's because of my lacking language skills, that I haven't heard anything about Burma yet, but I think that it's worthy to say that the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, their Center for the Prevention of Genocide, recently identified Burma as the #1 at-risk country for state-led mass killing. And I think that our community in particular has a responsibility to speak up and be pretty loud about the threat and the building genocidal activity and genocidal intent in Burma. I'm also a research associate at the School of International Service, where I'm conducting research on Bangladesh's current war crimes tribunal as well. In 2010, I lived and worked in Rwanda, writing mostly about human rights and land reform. This work is part and parcel of that research. Before and during the Rwandan genocide in 1994, France was responsible for not only arming, but also training, and perhaps most importantly, politically protecting the regime of Juvenal Habyarimana in Kigali. French troops under the Operation Waro and subsequently Operation Turquoise moniker were largely welcomed by the Rwandan military, but also were welcomed, as you see here, by the informal Interahamwe militias, death squads, whatever you would like to call them. They were widely seen as specifically combating the rebel RPF, which it was led by now President Paul Kagame. This is Rwanda in 1994. Zone Turquoise in the southwest, rather than effectively stopping genocide, served as a corridor through which many of the genocidaires eventually escaped into the DRC at the end of the genocide. That zone was established by the French as a safe zone. However, many pogroms and genocidal events occurred in Zone Turquoise under French control. Naturally, France continues to deny these allegations 20 years later, despite continued allegations from the Rwandan government. Alongside a French parliamentary report, material from the Mitterrand archives that were recently translated by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and Rwanda's own Muccio Commission report that cite exceedingly deep intervention to support the Habyarimana government, if not full-fledged participation in genocide. So why, I think, is a big question. Why would a Western power, member of the Permanent Five on the Security Council, commit, be complicit in, or at the very least fail to prevent and punish a genocide in a small, impoverished East African country? Well, Gerard Prunier, among others, have located the intent, the motivation behind France's involvement in the so-called Fashoda syndrome, which stems from the Fashoda incident in the late 19th century, which is basically explained as a confrontation, a military confrontation between French and Great Britain, wherein Great Britain delivered a humiliating defeat to France, who had planned to go up the Nile and set up a dam so that they could control water flows into Egypt, thereby inciting and instigating more anti-Anglophone sentiment in Egypt. They obviously failed, and from this emerges the Fashoda syndrome, whereby France has an emerging fear of les Anglais, the Anglo-American geopolitical threat, Rwanda lying at the edge of French East Africa, the RPF being from Uganda, being English-speaking, really inciting and having U.S. ties over and above that. Paul Kagame was trained militarily in the U.S., really engaged with the so-called Fashoda syndrome. Other factors that promoted French involvement were the personalization of the diplomatic relationship between Mitterrand and Habyarimana, but also a solid French-African UN voting bloc, and some have alleged a corrupt money laundering scheme based on contracts with between Rwanda and various other French-African nations. So, with regard to legal responsibility, you can look to the Bosnia v. Serbia decision from the ICJ, which is the only case that's taken under the jurisdiction of the Genocide Convention. There's potential to argue that France may be in violation of an Article 3 violation, which would be complicity in genocide. But my presentation and my research primarily focuses on French violations of Article 1, which is the obligation to prevent and punish, which all states parties to the Genocide Convention have. The Bosnia v. Serbia decision, released in 2007, provides a valuable rubric to understand a potential Rwanda v. France case that has yet to materialize. And I'll go over the various. It's good to note here, though, that every state, by not failing to prevent and to punish, does not incur a violation under Article 1. But given France's ability to not only cease development aid, but to politically sway the Habyarimana government away from committing a genocide, had enough diligence and power to prevent, and so by not taking that diligence to prevent, actually violated Article 1. So there's precedent for the failure to prevent. It's not only found in the Genocide Convention, but also the Torture Convention and numerous other international conventions. As I mentioned, the due diligence requirement refers back to the clear responsibility to prevent, that states parties to the Genocide Convention are not responsible for the prevention of genocide that is beyond their control, but have the concept of due diligence, which works in combination with the capacity to influence, which again, I've noted that France had that capacity. Primarily, the ability to influence a genocidal regime is marked by two qualities, which are geographical distance and the strength of political ties, but other relational characteristics may apply as well. The mobilization of Operation Turquoise confirmed armed transfers in the summer of 1994 in the midst of an arms ban and a genocide, and political cover in the Security Council constitute clear violations of that due diligence requirement. Thirdly, as you see here, the court refines the temporal standards for prevention with regard to genocide, basically to the specific intent, or in Latin, the dolus specialis, to commit genocide, which can arguably be maintained from 1990, when we have reports of the planning of the genocide occurring in the upper echelons of the right-wing Hutu movement, but certainly applies to throughout the genocide and earlier in 1994. The prominence of anti-Tutsi Hutu power rhetoric on the radio, in the military, and the upper echelons of the Rwandan government was public knowledge. Moreover, there are multiple instances wherein scholars and activists submitted official documentation specifically forewarning the French government, of the impending genocide. So it seems prima facie absurd to assert that France would be without knowledge of the Dolus Specialis in that period, particularly considering the French forces on the ground that were at least witness to various ethnic pogroms. Finally, the court provides a clear distinction between the failure to prevent genocide and the standards that could prove complicity in genocide, which would be, again, Article 3. Fundamentally, the violation of the responsibility to prevent is a crime of omission, whereas complicity is a crime of commission. As I've mentioned, there might be evidence to prove French complicity. However, I'll stick to the failure to prevent and the failure to punish. In the Bosnia v. Serbia case, the failure to punish primarily stemmed from Serbia's reluctance to submit former war criminals to the ICTY. That's not so different in the France-Rwanda situation. Foremost among these is the former First Lady, Agatha Habyarimana. Madame Agathe was a central player in the planning and execution of the genocide. Her northern Hutu roots really bolstered her husband's political position within the Rwandan government and put her in a position of significant authority within the Akazu, the group of elite extremist Hutus responsible for plotting the genocide in the highest echelons of power. After the genocide, she spent several years in various African countries before fleeing to France in 1998, where she lived rather comfortably in Paris on a stipend from the French government, until she was eventually arrested in 2010 on the authority of an international arrest warrant that Rwanda issued in October 2009. This is after the ICTR refused to prosecute. Charges against her include genocide, complicity in genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide, creation of a criminal gang, murder and conspiracy to commit murder, extermination, and public incitement to commit genocide. She also currently faces civil charges brought by a human rights organization. She was immediately released from prison on the condition that she remain in France, which continues to refuse Rwanda's adamant requests for extradition. Earlier this year, France made news by prosecuting one of these former genocidaires who was found living on the French island of Mayotte under a pseudonym. He was actually captured for using false papers, and the French authorities realized who he was, which was Pascal Simbikangwa. A French court found him guilty of complicity in genocide and crimes against humanity, subsequently sentencing him to 25 years in prison. This could be seen as a significant step in France's fulfillment of the responsibility to punish the perpetrators of genocide. However, the Simbikangwa case shed little light on French involvement, a move that some have noted as deliberate on the part of the French authorities. Still, other genocidaires continue to live in France. Trials are pending in the cases of Father Wenceslas Munyasheka and Laurent Bucci Baruta. As with Ms. Habyarimana, the French legal system has proceeded slowly in these cases, so slowly, in fact, that the European Court of Human Rights has issued a condemnation of France in 2004 for its failure to prosecute. A special unit now exists within the French judiciary to prosecute these crimes specifically, but so far it's been inconsistently funded and moved rather slowly. So this is a brief timeline of the political context that I would like to provide. Outside of this sort of legal jargon, and I apologize if it's too legalistic, today's political context between Rwanda and France continues to be rather tenuous. In 1995, right after the RPF government took power, France refused to recognize that new government in Kigali and excluded them from the Franco-Africa Summit. In 1998, the French Parliamentary Commission on the Genocide, this is a quote from the report, France maintained its presence and developed its military cooperation against a background of ethnic tensions, massacres, and violence, as if impervious to a context whose seriousness it underestimated. The parliamentary report is, I think, encapsulated by this quote, the idea that France underestimated merely the amount of violence and was not aware of the genocidal nature of it. The release of the Mitterrand archives in 2005 seems to confirm this. The documents reiterate Mitterrand and his administration's framing of the conflict as between Francophone and Anglophone forces in the heart of the French sphere of influence, which harkens back to Prunier's theory of the Fashoda syndrome. They also include serial situation updates that accurately portrayed the tense situation in Kigali, making note of the various ethnic pogroms that occurred in the lead up to genocide. Notably, however, it remains unclear just how many documents are not included in the release of this material. A year after the Mitterrand archive was leaked, which at first appeared to signify a move toward the acceptance of responsibility, a French judge, Jean-Louis Bruguière, released a report of the shooting down of President Habyarimana's plane, the event that sparked the genocide. The report was the result of an 8-year investigation and accused Paul Kagame of ordering the shooting down of the plane by RPF forces, a fact which has been significantly contested, particularly by the current Rwandan government, Paul Kagame included. He, however, nonetheless issued an arrest warrant, several arrest warrants for high-profile Rwandan politicians, including President Kagame. However, Mr. Kagame was and remains protected by head of state privilege against the French warrant. However, Judge Bruguière also attempted to convince the ICTR to follow suit and put the president on trial. The latter attempt did not succeed. The ICTR refused that request. The Bruguière report claims that the RPF arranged the attack, having full knowledge of the potential for retaliatory mass atrocities against Tutsis, and it so angered Kigali that the Rwandans completely severed diplomatic ties, recalling their ambassador, etc., in 2006. In 2008, ties were finally restored after several back-channel negotiations, and also after Rwanda had time to release the 331-page monster of the Muccio Commission report on French involvement in the genocide, which accuses France of significantly more involvement than was previously admitted, for instance, in the Mitterrand archives. According to the report's most damning accusations, quote, French soldiers themselves were involved in assassinations of Tutsis and Hutus accused of hiding Tutsis. French soldiers committed many rapes, specifically with Tutsi women. To many, such acts were seen as being part of the French policy. Obviously, these are some serious accusations from the Kagame administration accusing France of actually taking part in a genocide, and that French policy was in accord with the genocidal intent. In 2009, the ties were restored. Curiously, on the same day, Rwanda also announced that it would join the British Commonwealth, despite never having been a British colony. Rwanda became the second such country after Madagascar to enter the Economic Association, and around the same time, Rwanda also began the process of switching its primary language and its educational system from French to English after Kinyarwanda. Alongside further integration into the largely Anglophonic East African community, these shifts seem to confirm France's long-held fears of the Anglophone threat. In 2009, Nicolas Sarkozy also made his now famous trip to Rwanda, where he admitted that France, quote, might have made some mistakes, a far cry from Bill Clinton's full-fledged appeal for forgiveness. Stopping short of the full apology, Sarkozy's speech reflects the French unwillingness to accept the full moral or legal responsibility for its actions in Rwanda in the early 90s. Within this context, these cases, among others, Simbikangwa and Ms. Habyarimana, appear to be part and parcel of the broader rapprochement between the two countries, although, as I will mention shortly, that rapprochement has seemed to hit on the rocks. In 2010, Agatha was arrested and charged, although immediately released, as I said. The trial has again proceeded slowly. 2014, on the Kwibuka, the 20th commemoration of the genocide in April, relations were once again made more complicated by renewed political conflict between the RPF, the French government, and their competing narratives of genocide and genocide history. 5 years after the restoration of diplomatic relations, President Paul Kagame, once again publicly in various interviews, namely one with Jeune Afrique, accused France of playing a direct role in the genocide. After the article was released, France pulled their foreign minister, Christian Taubira, from attending the ceremony in Kigali. Relations once again are on the rocks as cases against Ms. Habyarimana and the other expatriate genocidaires inch forward under the jurisdiction of underfunded prosecutors. I think this picture pretty adequately summarizes the French-Rwandan relationship right now as it stands. In the end, what we see occurring across this broad history is the mutual manipulation of national and international narratives, legal instruments to maintain these two competing histories of the genocide. On the side of France, the narrative is relatively simple. It's one of denial and one of forgetting. The French government seeks to absolve itself of its serious legal violations by continually denying its involvement, despite the significant evidence to the contrary, some of which ironically emanates from the French government itself in the form of the French parliamentary report and the Mitterrand archives. Rwanda's narrative is a bit more complex as it deals with both domestic and international politics. First and foremost, the Kagame administration maintains the narrative account of the genocide against the Tutsi, and while that might be an accurate framing in terms of intent, specifically to destroy the Tutsi ethnic group in whole or in part, and I tend to use scare quotes when I say ethnic, as we all know the Tutsi-Hutu divide was largely a socioeconomic division in prehistory that was codified by Belgian colonialists. This narrative, however, avoids the difficult facts of history. As we all know, again, not only were moderate Hutus killed, but also that according to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Kagame and the RPF killed between 25 and 45,000, mostly civilian Hutus, over the course of their invasion and taking back of the country. The narrative often forgets to acknowledge these crimes. Today, it's easy for Kagame to distract from his administration's increasingly horrendous human rights record by re-emphasizing France's role in the genocide as occurred in April of this year during the Kwibuka ceremonies. Neither country has fully taken responsibility to punish genocide crimes. France continues to move too slowly with the prosecution of various genocidaires within its jurisdiction by underfunding the relevant bodies within the French judicial system. Rwanda has yet to bring a case to the ICJ, a case that would finally lay the appropriate blame on France, but that may also risk shedding light onto the RPF's crimes or otherwise murky human rights record. Both countries have a stained historical record and both continue to deflect responsibility by maintaining their own flawed narratives. It's unlikely, though, that the victims of the Rwandan genocide will ever achieve catharsis, whether legal or otherwise. But nonetheless, the governments of France and Rwanda continue to make sure of that by obscuring the truth in the name of often problematic national interests. Thank you.
And I'm sure that there will be a hostile debate about the point that they release in their lecture. So we have almost half an hour. Okay, I will start by a question to Robert about the role of France. Are you aware of the intense debate that is currently in France about the responsibility and of France in the genocide? And do you think that there is a possibility, there is a chance that from this debate, from this intellectual debate, with many publications against the French position and French denial, there will be a possibility that from the grassroots movement, it will emerge a sort of conscience or feeling of responsibility about, or are you pessimistic for the chance of such a movement?
It's difficult to say. As France continues its policy of intervention in Africa, when you look at the Central African Republic and Mali, for instance, most recently, you don't see a whole lot of hope for the future of France holding responsibility, not to mention the resurgence of Nicolas Sarkozy in French politics. As far as the academic debate goes, I think that today the responsibility for the punishment is largely, first of all, in the hands of Rwanda, which continues to refuse to bring a case to the ICJ. I think that's probably the most significant source of potential responsibility. Outside of that seemingly more and more far-fetched possibility, within France, I think that they're moving more rapidly now with the prosecutions, although again, it's highly politicized, and as a legal issue, the prosecution of these crimes should not be a political issue to be funded or underfunded at the whim of politicians, but should go forward with especially Madame Agathe, but also the various other genocidaires that continue to live in France, whether they're in prison, whether they're on house arrest. France has to move forward without politicizing it as a part of the liberal Western democratic international community.
Maybe other question? Yeah. Okay, so we will agree. No? Oh, yeah, thank you.
A question about your last comment. Could you explain how you see France's intervention in Mali to prevent an Islamist takeover as being a bad thing?
I didn't mean to necessarily characterize it as a bad thing. No, not at all. I simply meant to say that France's policy of unilateral, relatively speaking, intervention in African countries where it maintains a colonial history isn't necessarily in accord with the international law surrounding intervention. I think that France's intervention in Mali certainly achieved the goal of stabilizing the country for a certain period, but there wasn't a whole lot of follow-up there.
May I respond, or is that?
Please.
Could it be that the issue about international conventions, but norms of protection? And France was exercising a norm of protection here in keeping with the values of responsibility to protect, since no one else wanted to.
Right, and perhaps that's more sailing on the, sorry? It's more of a failing on the part of the international community as a whole to do some coalition building. I think the responsibility to protect in its various outlines, whether that's Gareth Evans or the ICISS report or World Summit Outcome document, really emphasizes not only the responsibility to intervene in times of mass violence that governments neither have the will nor capacity to prevent, but emphasizes the prevention and the punishment sides of that equation as well. And within the intervention, it's key that it follows a rubric, and whether or not that's simply UN Security Council authorization, it should go along with the norms that were established in this sort of illegal but legitimate Bosnian intervention, where we see a coalition that acts outside of the United Nations but quickly comes back after the initial intervention to the UN norms, to the UN system.
So question again. So maybe it's illegal, but it's very beautiful. And there are many things that are legal, but they stink.
Another question?
I will.
Okay.
Yeah, the question is to Robert and to you, Dennis. The fact that French have committed what they committed, and the fact that French committed crimes against humanity, even not genocide, during the War of Independence of Algeria, and that they have learned much more now, how we can explain it? And this was some years after the Second World War and the Holocaust. And what is the meaning that a state like French, with human rights, the French, the first democratic modern society, state, commit such crimes and continue to deny it? France recognized very lately the crimes regarding the French Jewry, which is okay, late, but I think now it's quite correctly, and at least the French governments admit it. But how do we explain it, and what is the meaning? For Professor Bauer will speak about it later. How we can try to prevent, honestly, genocide when a state like France, is involved in a genocide crimes and deny it with all the French intelligence, excuse me, that I respect them. And your perspective that this will not change the future of French attitude.
As for France, I can explain it by no. Yes. The question was about how it's possible that France, the first democratic state in modern era, has so many or performed so many acts of that can be compared to genocide or massive violence like in Algeria. And why it was possible for France to recognize her responsibility as for French Jewry in 1995, but a part of the work of intellectuals that deserve respect for them, there is no so clear and affirmative confession of the responsibilities of France in Algeria and also Rwanda. I think that as it's a political reason, it's a political matter. For Algeria, I think that the importance in the French policy of the army and of the what we call the pieds noirs, I mean the settlers that left Algeria to France, are two pillars that can explain why there is no political will to do the work. My second explanation is that I think that there is like a division of work. I mean that further intellectuals have to do, the historians, the intellectuals have to do the job to release all the document, all the explanation, all the story of the war. And it was the case as for the French Jewry. I mean, before that, Chirac recognized that France participated and has responsibility in the genocide of French Jewry. We have almost 20 years of very documented and very massive and huge works that were done by historians, but also, you know, by playwrights and movies and so on. I mean, intellectuals, I don't mean only the scientific research, but also the popular and the artistic branch. And it was done as for the French Jewry, since Paxton's very famous book about Vichy's France, and until 1995 when Chirac. Of course, there was also the role of the French Jewish community, that was, and especially some organizations, and Serge Klarsfeld and Beat Klarsfeld that were very active in this process. And I will add, as for Algeria, that when Maurice Papon was held in trial because of his responsibility of what he did in Bordeaux in 1942, but it was also the chief of police in France in 1961 when there were a murder of Algerian demonstrators in Paris. And so we do the connection, or they did the connection, and since then, now after so many years of scientific work about French Jewry, now there is a very great development of studies about Algeria. And since there is some steps, for example, about the events of October 1961, the demonstrations that they sank demonstrators in the Seine, in the river. So Jospin, that was prime minister, decided to release all the archives connected to this special event. In 1997, they decided only in 1997 to declare that the events of Algeria can be declared as a war. And I think that we have to wait also 10 years, maybe, in order to have a gesture compared to what Chirac had done. So.
More than 1 million victims.
For Algeria, 4,000. It's the Algerian version.
Yair, as usual, I owe you thanks. Because your remarks asking how can it be that a country of egalite intellectuals can deny, the answer, my friend, is, as you know only too well, including your fabulous contributions, name me one country in the world that has not engaged in denials of genocides that it committed, genocidal massacres, genocides large scale. Name me a country that is not a party to denials of other genocides because of political, realpolitik considerations. And why do I thank you? I thank you because you've inspired me to ask for another life now that I'm old, and I will try to establish a new international commission against denials of genocide.
Maybe you can at some point.
No, I think Professor Charney stole my thunder on that one, as it were. It really is true. And as an American making a presentation on Rwanda, I think I often get the criticism that, well, how can you talk about Paul Kagame? How can you talk about France? How can you talk about... I have no illusions about the faults of the American government, particularly the current administration's policy on drones, for instance, one of many. And Professor Charney said it, it's an issue of this broadly defined national interest of political will, and ultimately, in France's case, that's leading to genocide denial.
What does it mean? That moral does not exist whatsoever in political life? It's difficult to admit it. Maybe I am too naive.
No, I think that is the job of the academic realm of intellectual.
Intellectual, not academics.
Okay, of intellectuals. Okay.
You're playing safe.
I think that any people and any nation. I mean, the fact that some nation has beautiful pages in history doesn't prevent herself to write also dark pages. It's a case for France, a case for any country that I know in the world. I mean, there is no chosen peoples, even if they have a very great contribution to humanity. It was said also for Germany.
And coming from Washington, D.C., I think I can fairly safely say that when it comes to politics, there is no morality. We just went through one of the most particularly nasty midterm election cycles today, last night, and it didn't turn out too well, so it's probably likely that it's going to get less moral.
Oh, the elections.
Democrats lost.
Yes, Gabriel. You want to do?
No, you gotta speak here. No, take, please. Yes, I listen with very interest the classification that Professor Israel Charmi made, but I want to put a question, because for me there is a lack in this classification. We can, I think, generally is important to discuss the classification, examining the history, because after the history are very more complex when we go with the classification. But what I want to say that we have to see also the history from another point of view, from the point of view of the prevention of the genocide, and how the men react to genocide. So we have to look to the perpetrator, to the victim, but we have to look also how the society, the state, the men react to this event. No? And for me, this is a big lack in general research. That I know that in Israel start this definition of righteous, no? That for me was a very important definition, but I think that we have to go on this definition, because it will be important as for studying the genocide and give a moral heritage to prevent the genocide, to emphasize and to give importance to all the men that react in every context, because there are men that react against the Shoah, but there are men who reacted in Rwanda. Few. The men reacted during the Armenian genocide. There are men who reacted during Bosnian, as we don't know, we call this ethnic cleansing or genocide, but it doesn't matter for me. So we have to work on this direction, and I think that if we think that genocide exists in our history, we continue. I completely agree with Professor Yehuda Bauer that say the men are predators, and they will continue killing, because the killing will continue in every generation. You count the name of the killing during different kind of genocide, so you have to work of a moral category that you present to the humanity as people who go against the genocide. So this is really the big question. So you have to work on that, because the value, the men who take the value to fight against a genocide, these men have to be recognized as an example, not only because we are grateful for that, but to give example to future generations. So we have not only to tell the story of the victim, but the righteous. And I finish that I want to ask to Mr. Israel Charmi that the European Parliament made a very important decision that was perhaps not in Israel was not very perceived, but the European Parliament voted a statement to recognize the righteous for all the genocide. And this was, for me, a very important event, and I want to know what is the thinking of Professor Charmi about that.
Say one word about your association, please.
Nobody.
Not nobody, but some people don't know.
But my name
is Gabriel Nissim, and I try to work with my association to popularize the concept of the rights for all the genocide. That because the example that was in the history of the Shoah, have to be an example for other genocide. And this have a certain success because we discussed that in Rwanda, and we are working on that with Mugagazana, with the Armenian in the Erevan Museum, they start a foundation and for remember the rights of the Armenian genocide, and we are also working in Cambodia and in many also capital of Europe about that. So this is my work. I am a writer, and but for me, what is important is how is possible to give more importance to the positive figure that deal with a genocide. This is a question open that very few speak about. Thank you.
I appreciate every word that you said. I appreciate the passion, the soul with which you speak. And I think your remark that responses to genocide is a major dimension that we should look at is absolutely correct. And I thank you, and I will add it to the worksheet. Thank you very much.
שאלות נוספות? אם לא, אז...
If I can, just a word on prevention, and I think that you're absolutely correct when you say the shift in genocide studies really should focus more on prevention, because that's really what we want, right? We don't need to necessarily look back and say that was genocide or that was genocide, but say genocide is coming, and we need to be aware of it. And the problem with that might be that, as we've mentioned, political will just often isn't there. What happens if we have early warning? I mean, there are multiple organizations currently working on developing various systems, as I'm sure your own. And it's the problem of translating. We have prevention capabilities, we have early warning capabilities into policy, into saying we can prevent, we can go in and say, you never again this time, not never again after it's happened, but never again this time. And that's what's so concerning, I think, about Burma, Myanmar currently, is that we see the buildup, we know it's building up, we can see it happening again and again and again, and we know that it's the number one at risk, and what's happening. They're hosting the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Summit. Burma is. Every country in Southeast Asia is going. Barack Obama is going, and no one's saying the name Rohingya for fear of upsetting ties with the central Burmese government. So I think it's important to focus on early warning, focus on prevention activities, but I also think that it's important to raise the voices for motion, for policy, to actually enact those early warnings, to do something before more genocides, more mass atrocities, more mass killings occur.
Yolande, okay.
C'est juste pour remercier les intervenants. Vous m'entendez?
Oui, très bien.
Oui, c'est juste pour remercier les intervenants, surtout Robert, quand il a parlé de toutes les étapes en France et qu'il a rajouté deux choses qui sont très importantes. Le contexte de Fashoda. Quand je l'ai écrit dans mon premier livre, la France est devenue folle. Moi, je trouvais que c'était ça. Et je disais à la France, c'est dommage. Vous avez massacré mes enfants qui étaient francophones au nom de la France contre les anglo-saxons. Tu traduis d'abord ça?
Yolande wants to thank Robert for his details of the long story of France in Rwanda, and especially the idea of Fashoda complex. She wrote about it in her book, and many in France say that she's full, but she told them that France, you murder my sons that were French-speaking in the name and in the sake of France's destiny and France's interest.
Personne n'a compris ce que c'est la France-Afrique, ne comprendra jamais les interventions de la France dans nos pays. Ça, c'est une chose. La deuxième chose, les pays occidentaux qui interviennent dans des pays par les militaires, par je ne sais pas quoi, ce n'est pas pour nos beaux yeux qu'ils viennent. En général, il y a des intérêts derrière d'abord.
Okay, Yolande said that about the intervention of France in Mali and Centrafrique, that we can understand why France is so involved, so deeply involved in this country, unless you understand the concept of France-Afrique. It's a word, in only one word, to compress France and Africa in sort of symbiosis that is very poisonous. And she said that France is not, didn't intervene in Africa for the Africa highs, but because of the interest, the national interest.
C'est dans des milieux universitaires comme ça, on peut s'asseoir, se regarder en face et se dire la vérité pour que nos générations n'héritent pas des mensonges des politiques.
And pray that if it will be possible to have some conferences between Rwanda partners and French partners in order to tell the truth, and in order that the next generation will not live with lies. I want to end the meeting by quoting some sentences that I translate like that just now from Charles Péguy. Charles Péguy, that was a defensor of the Dreyfus affair. And he wrote in one of his plays these sentences. I will read it in English. We need years and years to build a man. We need works and words to make a man. We need only 1 minute to destroy a man. 1 minute, and that's all. It's very simple and it's very easy. So we are the party of those who are building, and they are the party of those who are destroying. They will be always stronger than us. Thank you.